Good afternoon and welcome to this online discussion on Europe's coronavirus roadmap to recovery. My name is Rosa Balfour. I am the new director of Carnegie Europe, and I'm delighted to host this discussion with our scholars. From Berlin, we have Judy Dempsey, whom I'm sure everybody knows, the editor of our Strategic Europe blog. From Paris, Pierre Vimont, another one of our scholars and also former French and European diplomat, and Stefan Lehne from Vienna, also a scholar of ours and a former Austrian and European diplomat. The EU leaders met last week, online of course, to decide to agree on a package of steps to accompany European states and citizens through a recovery plan, in the hope that after a faulty start, this package will put Europe on better footing to face this devastating coronavirus, which is going to have a very negative impact on European economy, but also on all other aspects of public and private life. And this is what we want to talk about here today with our scholars. We want to start with some perspectives from member states, because I think the past few years have shown how important public opinion has become for Europe and how important the national debates are in shaping the possible responses that EU leaders can collectively reach. So we will start from Berlin, because the understanding is that it was a shift in Germany's position that made possible the agreement reached last week at the European Council. We will then move on to Paris, and of course we know that Paris and Berlin haven't always been on the same foot in how to deal with the coronavirus. And then we'll move on to Vienna, which represents a third position with respect to how to deal with coronavirus. And I will chip in as well with a few points coming from the country that has been most severely hit, and early on, that is Rome. And then from there, we will move on to discuss some broader implications, look at medium-term prospects for Europe to deal with this major crisis, but also what lies ahead, and take a look also at the opportunities or not for European global leadership in the coronavirus, but also in other policy themes, which should never be forgotten, even if we're living under this fog due to the uncertainty of this pandemic. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Judy. I'll ask you to be brief, but we've talked about this already. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions from the audience, so we can time for them. Please, Judy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa, and hello to everybody virtually out there. The situation in Berlin is actually quite complicated, in the sense that there's a gap between the kind of domestic agenda and in some ways the lack of an agenda for a long-term European strategic policy in terms of foreign policy and other issues. Now, Angela Merkel has regained her credibility and her stature and her I use the word carefully, charisma. Even though she won't stand again, she has taken over the entire leadership of the country, has been a steady hand, has been stable, but has stressed that we are in here for the long haul and there's no easy fixes to overcome this pandemic. And she has tried on the domestic level, no panic, we're going to keep the restrictions as long as is psychologically possible and physically possible. It's beginning to fray the edges here. But we have seen a jump again in the infections in Germany. So in some ways, sadly, Merkel's caution has been yet again vindicated. So the domestic side, restrictions a little bit easier, but no rush to lift everything. Now, on the European side, Merkel has a long memory, and she remembers the big financial and euro crisis and how she was heavily criticized by Greece and other countries for her very, very tough austerity measures and trying to keep the euro together, but not throwing money and grants into Greece and Italy, Spain and Portugal and Ireland. And the southern countries now have come back again. The old divisions are back, and Germany is again being criticized. Merkel has tried to bridge the gap by getting France as her ally, trying to find some compromise, which they tried to reach in Brussels, but they're going back to the table still next month. But at the moment, Merkel is hoping that there can be a kind of fudge over how to really bail out Italy, and her fear also that Greece will go through another major crisis. So essentially, we're seeing a kind of language gap between her reassuring the German public that the measures are important, but even though she admits herself this is an extraordinary European crisis, she said that the biggest since 1945, the enormity of this problem actually is not being tackled by Berlin.
Can I just press you slightly on this? Do you think there has been a shift in the German position over the past few weeks? We've seen, for instance, the Greens and the SPD speak favorably about Euro bonds or Corona bonds. Has there been a shift, and is that putting pressure? We've also seen opinion polls suggesting that Germans are actually quite willing So do you think that shift is there, even with the caution that you mentioned?
I think the shift is coming because, unlike the Euro crisis, this crisis is a human crisis. Mm-hmm. People are dying. And so, firstly, and secondly, the Germans know Italy very, very well. And there's a real sense of emotional solidarity with the people, with the children, with their friends, and with the enormous suffering that the Italians have gone through, the enormous number of deaths. So I think Merkel is very acutely aware of public opinion, and that's where she monitors things. And I think the shift is coming. The pressure, I think, will continue, but Merkel hasn't gone over the other side yet. And although her finance minister is a little bit more sympathetic towards it, as his French counterpart is as well, she hasn't yet gone over the other side. She's afraid to, because the Germans will have to know that they will have to pay up for this.
Thank you. I'll move to Pierre. So France, at one point, it looked like France, together with Italy, Spain, they signed a letter asking for Eurobonds, asking for a different kind of European involvement in this crisis. And of course, Macron has, I think everybody's read the long transcript of the interview that Macron gave to the Financial Times. But then when push came to shove, the idea of having a group of countries moving forward with Eurobonds was not pursued. What is it? Does France still privilege the Franco-German axis? What is Paris thinking in this regard?
I think there are two reasons for that. The first one is that the French president has been engaged in a lot of discussion and back and forth with Chancellor Merkel and also with Prime Minister Rutte to try to overcome the differences. And I think he has definitely assessed before the European Council that it would be very difficult to reach an immediate agreement, at least, on how to move forward, either with these Corona bonds or whatever other possible way of moving forward, so that it was better not to engage once again, as in the previous European Council, with a new brawl between the South and the North. And for the purpose and for the sake of European unity and solidarity, it was better to try to keep on discussing and moving forward, and therefore to task the European Commission and Mrs. von der Leyen with coming out with some proposition, mostly related to the EU budget and to this new financial package for the next 7 years, which is certainly a very brave move to do. As we all know, this financial package up to now has not been approved by all member states, to say the least. So to double down on this seems to be a very courageous move forward. It's worth trying to. The second.
Maybe unmute yourself because I can hear some voice returning. Judy?
No, I haven't been muting myself. It's just.
Judy?
Do you hear me now? And so that was, I think, the first reason. By the way, just a quick remark, it's fascinating to see how these virtual European councils are creating a new way of negotiating between member states, because as we all know, virtual negotiations are somewhat complicated. And so we're seeing more frequent European Council without clear outcome, but one step after the other, we see maybe some interesting moves, and this is the new way for the leaders to work together. Each European Council becomes a sort of non-story, but if you add them together, it creates the feeling that something is maybe moving. And this is where maybe sometimes I feel that the media in charge of following the European Union affairs have difficulty in understanding this new change. Now, the second reason I think for this difficulty that the French are finding at the moment is in their relationship with Germany, is that this crisis has created a further division, a new fault line in the European Union, which is already quite fragmented. But on top of the economic imbalance between Germany and France, I think we have witnessed with this crisis a health imbalance, sanitary imbalance, whatever you call it, in a field where the French were very proud of their performance, namely their national health system, which was even considered at some point a few years ago by The Economist as the best in Europe. And suddenly, with this crisis, we found out that it was badly equipped, short in face mask, beds, testing, so on and so forth, protective equipment. So the personnel in the hospital have been fighting, as we all know, performing very well to overcome these difficulties. But it has created once again the sense that France was lagging behind Germany. And the discussion inside the society among the political circle is all about that. Why has France underperformed while Germany has well performed in this crisis? I think this has even increased the sort of lack of confidence in the French system, lack of confidence with regard to the ability of France to convince Germany to move forward, to build up on the French vision of what Europe should be. And this is why I think to some extent we're facing once again this hurdle that President Macron has been facing since he was elected. When he came in, you do remember his idea about European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. He has been repeated that again in his interview to the Financial Times, talking about a political plan, that Europe was a political project and we had all to understand that. But at the same time, because of the internal difficulties and the internal struggle France is facing with this health crisis, the messenger is maybe not well placed to send this kind of message. And this is what strikes me at the moment in this internal infighting between the Europeans, is that French ideas have caught a lot of momentum. People everywhere are telling the French are right, this is what we should do. But it's maybe not for the French to get it through because they are in these current difficulties. I don't know, but it seems to me that we're having a problem there.
Thank you, Pierre. I'd like to turn to Stefan now and ask him, Stefan, you published an article a week or two ago in the Austrian press saying that Austria, you need to unmute yourself. Austria de facto left the European Union at the end of March and seems to be quite happy. So unlike France, which is tormented by this lack of confidence, you know, whereas being one country with a vision for Europe, Austria seems to be quite content with having an Austrian vision and doesn't seem to have noticed. Is that correct? Or maybe things have changed in the past couple of weeks, Stefan?
Hello, Rosa. Yes, in fact, the Austrian government had a rather good crisis so far. They were quite early in the lockdown. They brought the infection rate down quite significantly, and now they are among the first countries to lift the restrictions again. And I would say there's a lot of support by the public for the government and its current policies. When it comes to European-led crisis management, Austria, as usual, is in the German camp. Sometimes they sort of overdo the frugal part a little bit. But then when Germany moves, as it usually does, towards a compromise, Austria follows along. And I have no doubt that this will be the case again. The interesting thing about Austria is that the government, like other governments in Europe, regained a lot of sovereignty in the crisis. Schengen is done, much of the internal market is not functioning anymore. There are no restrictions of a fiscal nature or state aid nature. And my sense is the Austrian government is rather enjoying this. I was a bit worried when the Austrian finance minister recently said that the state aid provisions should be suspended indefinitely because during such a difficult time, the government needs as much freedom of maneuver as possible to run things as they want. So I think that is interesting, that people cannot expect that the financial market will start functioning again magically at one point, because the crisis will be longer. It will be not rather clear when it is over. And I think many governments, not just the Austrian, want to hang on to some of the regained sovereignty that they got as a result of the crisis. So this is the first element. The second element is, to some extent, bilateral diplomacy has come back. The Austrians are negotiating with the Romanians about the possibility of travel for carers, for old Austrians. They are negotiating with Germany on medical equipment. And again, this is rather seen as rather positively. Government can do something. To some extent, this is necessary because the internal market doesn't work at the moment. But to some extent, the government is delivering on something which was usually before in the hands of the Brussels bureaucracy. And the third aspect is more sort of anecdotal. Is last week, Sebastian Kurz, the chancellor, had a video conference with the smart countries, which is sort of rather unfriendly because it presupposes that there are also dumb countries. But the small smart countries that are managing the crisis well are New Zealand, Australia, Israel, the Czech Republic, Greece, and Denmark, and Singapore. Now, again, I think this is a bit of a public relations gimmick, because I don't really think that Austria has a great deal to learn from Singapore in this case, situation. But the fact that they are doing this indicates that they are really sort of looking not so much at Brussels or as EU member states as a frame of reference, but try to develop a new kind of national foreign policy also when it comes to managing a health crisis. And again, I think this all means, all three aspects mean that this crisis is triggering, or rather sort of increasing, a centrifugal dynamic in the European Union. You remember the financial crisis, of course, created a lot of divisions, but ultimately member states did reforms that they couldn't do previously because they had the common enemy of the financial market. The migration crisis has, like the present one, a centrifugal quality, because you didn't have to do things together. You could also build fences, impose border controls, introduce limits to the people and refugees that you take in. And this one, unfortunately, has the same kind of dynamic, that people are less focused on Brussels and less focused on doing things on the European level. And there's sort of a preference to do things by their own, or through a coalition of alliance of maybe sometimes among EU countries, but sometimes also beyond it.
Thank you, Stefan. I'll keep this point on centrifugal dynamics for the next round of comments, but I would like to add a view from Rome. I'm based in Brussels, but I'm following the Italian debate. And of course, Italy was the country that was first hit by coronavirus, that is going to suffer, that has been badly hit, and that is going to suffer huge economic and financial consequences. So I think the perspective from Rome is important as we look at how the decisions in Brussels are seen in the various corners of Europe. The second reason it's important is that Italy has actually been a front runner on populism, right? And since the 1990s. So what happens there could actually give some indication of potential dynamics elsewhere. At the moment, the government the coalition government is formed by the Democratic Party of the Left, so the sort of Social Democrats, and a populist party that has been a swing party. It's moved from having a coalition agreement with the far-right League to having this coalition agreement with the PD. So the dynamic there is something that might be replicated in some form or another in the future. So in the context of the crisis, especially at the very beginning, Italians felt abandoned by their European partners. Italy has been very much exposed to Chinese propaganda and Chinese mask diplomacy. The feeling that Europe had abandoned Italy again was very, very strong. So actually the meeting last week was critical in making sure that the European Union stayed relevant for Italy and for Italian citizens. And the decisions reached, even though we still are missing the details, and even though the details will be essential in terms of shaping the package that Italy might have access to, but the decisions last week enabled the Italian government to say that Europe had listened, and enabled the Italian government to move out of a black hole that public debate had put it into, which was if either we get corona bonds or Europe has failed us. And so by moving out of that black hole, now the government has a bit more room for maneuver to negotiate package, to negotiate forms of loans, grants, subsidies, etc., that it can access through the recovery fund. So it's actually a pretty important decision. We know that at every European Council, national leaders go home saying we got what we wanted. So that's a pretty much standard communication style, but it was actually very important to hold the government. The government has good, not the government, the Prime Minister has good polling ratings at the moment, but things could change. And now that we move into exiting the restrictive measures, mistakes could be made and accidents could happen, and the comfort in which the current political leaders might feel because of their good ratings might, it's very ephemeral, it could end. Having just had a little tour of different views from different capital cities, let's focus a little bit on the EU. Stefan, you mentioned the centrifugal dynamics, and I think each of us actually highlighted that on the one hand, there's a question of Europe, there's a question of a need for cooperation. On the other hand, there are very strong instincts, either to go it alone or to distrust, or a sense of, as Pierre was saying, a sense of lack of confidence in the ability of the country to play that leadership role it aspires to. Looking a little bit, on the longer term perspective, do you think Europe will be able to pull out? We've been through a whole decade in saying Europe is on the brink of a crisis. This is bigger and broader and deeper than any of the crises we've been through over the past 10 years. European leaders got there weaker because the EU has been weakened by this succession of crises. Will it be able to pull through? What do you think? What are your medium-term prospects? Shall we go in the same order and start with Judy? Judy, you need to unmute yourself. You're still not unmuted. There we go.
There we go. there's this sort of political psychological dimension that once procedures are radically changed, it's very difficult to go back to the status quo ante. Mm-hmm. And what Stefan brings up is the whole issue of sovereignty and the member states being empowered. Well, the member states actually were calling so many of the shots over the last decade, and so was Germany. In fact, Germany started the going down this road of the what's called intergovernmental process, moving towards national state interests and away from the Commission way back in about 2001 when it broke the rules surrounding the euro. But what we have now is, first of all, it's a very contradictory situation. We have a fortress Europe, but within this fortress, we don't have the internal market. We don't have the free movement of people, of labor, just about capital functions. And can we go back when all this crisis is over? It's going to demand an enormous political will of the member states to cede the powers and the sovereignty that they have accrued and actually entrust the Commission to exert more authority. This is the first thing. And secondly, there's enormous tension between Berlin and Ursula von der Leyen, the EU President of the Commission. And the Commission, it was slow to get out of the starting blocks, but it still doesn't carry this heaviness, this credibility that one would expect it. Of course, health is not the remit of the Commission, but somehow it's far away from the member states. Will Europe come out of this stronger or weaker? Will it pull through? I think the jury is out. It's going to depend so much on Berlin. And Angela Merkel has not much time on her hands. Whether or not there will be a second bout of this virus, the leadership race is going to get cracking again to succeed her. These three candidates are already making the headlines again. And so the public attention and the media are going to tire of the virus, and they're going to home in on the post-Merkel era. So essentially, Europe has very little time, and Merkel herself has very little time to come up with actually not going back to the status quo ante, but making Europe rescuable. And I'm not sure this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to move now to Pierre with the same question.
Yes, with pleasure, Rosa. Coming back to what Stefan was saying, I understand very well the trend in many of the member states to feel rather comfortable with the current situation and to hang on to this exceptional situation. But this comes with a cost. The fact that we have suspended all the rules with regard to state aid, all the rules with regard to public procurement means that what is at the heart of the single market, namely the level playing field approach, is slowly crumbling down. And as we move along, and as the impact of this reality will come through, as we're going to see in the next few months, let's take, for instance, the whole air transport sector. When you're going to see the amount of public money that is going to be put by France, which has already started, but certainly by Germany and by many others, then suddenly there will be an outcry from many member states about unfair competition, and rightly so. This is the point precisely that the French president has been making. We are creating an asymmetrical crisis where we had a symmetrical crisis, because some countries are better provided with financial resources, with a better standard in the financial markets to outlive this crisis more than others. And if we don't stick together and we don't find ways of regaining that kind of solidarity between us, then it's going to be free for all. And that will be exactly going against what the whole European Union was built about. And I think we have to be aware of that. And if it's free for all, and we see, Rosa was alluding to that, Italy facing more and more difficulty, for instance, in the financial market, and we find ourselves in 6 months or 1 year facing the kind of financial crisis that we have been facing with Greece, then once again, behind the Eurozone, it will be the whole single market. So we're all there in it together, and we will only succeed together. And I think that remains the real issue. The second point I wanted to make, Rosa, was it's all very well for all these national decisions to be taken, each one of its own, but the reality of how the markets, financial markets and other markets are looking at the moment at Europe, at the end of the day, it's about, so far, the decisions that have been taken by the European Central Bank, and mostly the European Commission with its 2 or 3 propositions they have put on the table. In other words, by the EU institutions, when they can act on their own. And I think that's quite fascinating. And to some extent, this is what has happened with the last European Council. In order to regain some sort of solidarity, you have to come back to the traditional communautaire approach and go back to the European institutions, because they remain the strength of the whole system. Now, will they perform well as we move along? We will have to see. But I would certainly insist on the European Central Bank. This is what has brought back confidence in the markets towards Europe, nothing else, let's be honest.
Thank you. And Stefan, I'd like you to elaborate, but in this discussion also about centrifugal forces, shall we perhaps mention Hungary? We haven't talked about Hungary yet, but it looks like democracy in one country has definitely been sacrificed on the altar of fighting coronavirus, on the pretext of fighting coronavirus. What does that also mean for the future of Europe?
Sure. You know, the old saying goes that the EU emerges strengthened from every crisis, but I would say don't bet on it. No. This is different. And I think Europe has been sort of unlucky that it faces too many crises within a rather short period. The financial crisis, the refugee crisis, now this crisis, and we're already in the midst of the climate crisis, which we shouldn't overlook either. So I think this is huge challenges, and I don't think at the moment the overall sort of constellation of forces is very favorable to managing this very well. I think the key challenges, I think it's very evident what the crisis means is more inequality. Inequality both on the societal level, because the richer and more better educated people will do much better than the poorer ones, no question, but also among member states. There's no question that Germany can do a great deal more to speed up recovery than Italy. If you just compare the sums, they're doing a lot more already. And the South, both in terms of business structure, size of the tourism sector, which will not come back quickly, the current level of indebtedness is in a much, much weaker position. So as a result of the dynamic of the economic crisis, which we are only entering, I think the tensions between the South and the North will get much, much worse. And of course, Pierre is quite right. This is a symmetric crisis in the sense that everybody is suffering from it. But of course, some are suffering a great deal more. But the fact that everybody is suffering it is not exactly mobilizing the sense of solidarity, basically, because ultimately the first thought is always to your own citizens, to your own budget, to your own situation. And of course, if we have these tensions between North and South, I think also populism will come back without any doubt. At the moment, every government benefits basically from a lot of support because there's this rallying around effect from which every country, every government, whether it's liberal or dictatorial, is benefiting. But when the economic crisis gets worse, there will be a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and I think the populist challenge will come back in Italy, but also in many other countries. Now, regarding Hungary, you're right. One of the problems of this crisis is also it's crowding out many other very important issues. I think that also there is a tendency in all governments basically to grab power as a result of this crisis, because it's the natural instinct of governments to do. And that is, of course, particularly true with regard to Poland and with regard to Hungary. In Poland, you're going to have presidential elections with very little legitimacy because the campaign takes place in the extraordinary circumstances. And also there is this a judgment from the European Court of Justice that Poland has to block basically all action by the disciplinary committee of judges. And it's not at all clear whether Poland will abide by this judgment. And in Hungary, you have this extraordinary legislation that allows Orban basically to rule by decree without any kind of clear end date, and also very restrictive provisions concerning the freedom of media. Now, if you see this happening and look what happens in Brussels, very little ultimately. There is simply not a lot of attention to these issues at the moment. And the risk is, of course, that if there is no response and no reaction, governments are encouraged to continue along the same lines. I think what is hugely important, but I'm not extremely confident, but it's more important than ever before, is that in the context of the MFF negotiations, you actually introduce this conditionality between the access to the structural funds and the rule of law, respect for the rule of law. There's a proposal by the Commission. It's highly controversial. It's not just Hungary and Poland that oppose it, but a number of other countries are quite skeptical too. But if there is nothing in that, of that sort, there is no response to the challenge to the rule of law that we see, not just in these two countries, but also in others, I'm afraid this will again result in a weakening of the European Union.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each of you a broader question, maybe focusing on policy areas that perhaps are not at the centre of our attention right now. But before I do that, I'd like to encourage our audience to post questions. You can use social media to post questions and the chat function, and we'll go through them and put them to our speakers. Judy, today you published a blog piece on China, and indeed one, I think, non-controversial consequence of the current crisis is that US-China rivalry has been accentuated and accelerated. Where does the EU fit in this? What kind of, where do you see the EU moving on this front?
The real answer is that the EU is totally divided over its attitude towards China. Yes, the paper is out there, the big EU Commission strategy paper on China done over a year ago. But and the tools are there, but the problem is that the member states have entirely different interests. This is the first thing. Secondly, the EU itself and many of the member states, but not France, we're waiting for Germany. The Swedes have been on board on this. They've been incredibly, France and Sweden have been very critical of China, but the rest of the EU is rather timid. Are they waiting for the day after when the economy revives and they can go back to business as usual with China? But what we have here is China writing the narrative, disseminating a narrative about the so-called origins of the virus, putting huge pressure on German civil servants, huge pressure on the Western ambassadors in Beijing, huge pressure on any kind of lobby they can identify in Europe so that they can swing around public opinion towards the Chinese version of what happened or what did not happen. And China delivering masks and ventilators, not that they were all perfect. This is all about, getting the good feel factor in again. So the Europeans have been, in a nutshell, timid, and there's a few voices in Germany who are highly critical, and the key to the relationship with China will rest on how the European Union as a bloc and the member states will actually react to China getting into the 5G networks. This will be crucial. Germany holds the key to this. Britain is beginning to waver. They've set up a special committee to look at China's investments. The EU Commission is already warning that we have to now protect our own strategic investments. So there's a contradiction. Maybe this might be the shift, and the big countries will get together and say, now is the time to realize what is really at stake. It's the Chinese influence, and the Chinese influence really is about not only breaking further the transatlantic relationship, but eroding the kind of principles that we are supposed to uphold.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Judy. Pierre, yesterday when we talked, you also mentioned, the consequences on international politics, what kind of role the EU can find, also as a consequence of US-China rivalry, what kind of spaces are out there for the EU, what kind of impacts will this have externally? We're all focused on the internal dimension, but actually the rest of the world has not frozen. The UN called for a ceasefire of all conflicts. No, that was not followed. So the world out there continues to be complicated and difficult. Will the EU be able to play a role?
The international situation is undoubtedly very, very complicated. I think what is fascinating at the moment is that I think there is a clear awareness by everybody, every nation at the moment on the international scene, that there is a clear need for international cooperation if we want to get out, among other things, from the economic crisis we're facing. Not only for the transition out of the crisis, but even further on, as we move into new thinking about how globalization should be ruled, the whole issue about value change, the localization of strategic industry, so on and so forth. And what has been quite interesting so far has been that very little has happened up to now. You've had some interesting results, some very discreet, central banks working together, others more public, meetings of the G7, of the G20. But what has come out of these meetings was, for the time being, provisional decisions, I would say, suspending the debt towards Africa, more humanitarian assistance to the country the most affected by this virus crisis, initiative by President Macron and Ursula von der Leyen to mobilize the international community on creating some health assistance here again. This is good, this is moving in the right direction, but everybody is aware that we should go much, much further ahead and that there should be more ambitious. And this is where what's happening at the moment is fascinating, because to some extent, going exactly in the direction of what Judy was saying, we're finding out that to some extent geopolitics are trumping geoeconomics. In other words, the growing, increasing, exasperated antagonism between the United States and China is overshadowing any effort at the moment for some sort of international cooperation, because at the moment you're being asked to be on one side or the other. Either you're with China or you're with the United States. And we all know, I think, the rational attitude is that the truth is somewhere in between. And the path to recovery is to find some sort of compromise between these two antagonistic positions. And this is where exactly Europe should be. Europe is exactly there, right in the middle, being able on issues like the World Health Organization or trade, the future of international trade. Europe is actually there, the voice of reason that could try to bring everyone back together in moving ahead. A few years ago, it would have been the natural role of the US leadership to do that. But we don't have no more leadership at the moment because of this confrontation between America and China. And this is where Europe should come in. But, and I'm sure Stefan would agree with me, Europe is not in proper state to do that at the moment because of its internal division, because of its very slow process, because of its lack of agility. But I think what it could do is to try to convene a coalition of the like-minded to try to push forward the reasonable voice, the voice of reason, and the sensible path towards international cooperation and coordination. Countries like Canada, Japan, maybe India, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. The Austrian Chancellor's friends, the smart nations. These are the kind of countries that should be brought together, and Europe could take the lead there to bring everybody together, to try to move forward and to try to find a path that could be the right way to proceed. I think this is very urgent, by the way, and that we should be able to do that without further delay.
Thank you, Pierre. I have a question from Steve Erlanger from the New York Times, which speaks to you, Stefan, so I'm going to ask it. The question is on the impact of the Green Deal. The religion is there, recovery must be green, but there's a lot of entrenched interest in political panic. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think this is, if you read this beautiful paper that von der Leyen and Michel put forward at the last European Council on the roadmap to economic recovery, there's a lot about the Green Deal. It says the Corona crisis offers us an opportunity to put bad habits behind us, that the Green Deal is a growth strategy that will move towards a circular, sustainable, and highly competitive new kind of economy. But at the same time, in the of the Commission, every day you get letters from powerful industrial associations, from the cement industry to the plastics industry to the car industries, basically saying we need a relief of all kinds of standards and restrictions on emissions. We have to delay legislation because it's not realistic. We have to reprioritize our spending to basically bankroll the existing companies. So there is a huge conflict of interest between saving the existing jobs of companies that are on the brink of bankruptcy, basically, and creating new jobs in a new, greener, and more sustainable economy. And I'm not quite sure which way it's going, but I'm not very optimistic, because I think the unemployment rates we are going to see in the next few months will probably lead to a prioritization for the traditional economy, for the legacy industries that we should actually overcome. There's also the problem of the extremely low oil price, that the whole shift towards renewable energies will be held up by the fact that if oil costs very, very little, it's economically much more difficult to push forward this transition. So I think there is no vaccine against climate change, right? So ultimately, this is a huge issue. It's much more bigger than the Corona crisis. It's going to be with us for a very, very long time, and we don't have much time left. But the risk is, of course, that now there will be priorities basically to go back to the status quo before the crisis, rather than to move forward towards a better future.
I have a related question, which I'll throw out there, although I wonder how much detail we know at this particular point in time. And the question is from Eli Faid, will there be financial stimulus or fiscal incentives for a more resilient and sustainable economy as part of the recovery package? And of course, that decision, what the recovery fund will support, is pretty key in understanding, in having an idea of how Europe is going to go. Does anyone want to tackle this? Is this something, or Stefan, do you think you've addressed most of that question already?
Well, I would say that we don't know this. Now, the Commission has been charged to come up within the next month with a proposal on this recovery fund. And this proposal will of course, deal with the big and very tricky and controversial questions. How much of it will be loans? How much of it will be grants? It will have to deal with the conditions for granting these loans, the amount of it, but also it will define the purposes of expenditures. And I think obviously the key is economic recovery, but I think it will not be a clear give clear guidelines how to manage this conflict of interest that I've spoken about, the conflict between the old and the new. And there will be a huge mobilization of lobbying by interest groups trying to get as much out of this as possible.
I have two questions. Well, I'm bunching them together because they are about the future of the EU and the sort of mechanics of how EU holds together. One is about the centrifugal dynamics and what does it mean for the longer prospects for Europe as a genuine geopolitical actor? And has this crisis killed Macron's vision of a strong and independent Europe? And then my second question is, which is related, will this conversely eventually lead to reform inside of the EU and the ways in which it functions? And I'd like to ask you all perhaps to respond to these questions, not merely from a political and institutional perspective. And then if we have time, we can perhaps address a few more issues. Judy, would you like to start? Oh, Judy, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm coming. Okay, here we go. It's all talking about the new economy for me. Macron's vision for a stronger Europe and a more integrated Europe, it died from a very early beginning because it never got the sufficient response and support from Merkel. And the longer Germany dithered, the more gave an opportunity to the northern countries to actually push back on Macron's proposals. It's a great shame, actually. There was a chance to do this, but the political will wasn't there and the appetite wasn't there. And also with the ambiguity towards enlargement, what's happening in Ukraine, and also the Eurozone crisis, the feeling in Berlin especially was, this is not the time, but when is the time? And Macron was elected on a campaign of Europe, and Merkel was indebted to him, but she didn't deliver. And I think his proposal at the moment for Europe is dead. This is the first thing. Secondly, having said this, we're left with this European thing out there. And I've thought about this question on and off for the last month. In fact, for many years, Europe doesn't come out stronger from a crisis. We've been hearing this since the former Yugoslav war. It doesn't come out together. It doesn't become more integrated from a crisis, except this new crisis is a human crisis. It affects everybody. It's a global vulnerability. Nobody is exempt from this. And precisely because of this human dimension, perhaps Europe has to reform, because the very European way of doing things, the process which started in the 50s, it's redundant. It cannot deal with these new crises. It can hardly deal with globalization. And it cannot deal with the refugee crisis. And now it cannot deal with this huge, extraordinary pandemic, and there will be more. So if we talk about European reform, it's not just about legitimacy and democracy, it's about the way decisions are being made. And the process issue, which Pierre referred to, we're inflexible and so on, it's no longer applicable. We have to move out of this, but it's going to demand a new mindset from the leaders across Europe, and an awareness and a communication awareness that if we don't move Europe forward, we will become a set of disaggregated member states without clout or power or influence.
Pierre.
Very briefly, and just before answering your two questions, I would like to come back on what Stefan was saying, with which I totally agree on the recovery plan to some extent. Some of the points he was making will come out very forcefully when leaders have to decide on this recovery plan, because you will have the whole issue of conditionality. And where will conditionality be attached to? Will it be climate change? Will it be a social harmonization? So on and so forth. So, and this is what is going to make the whole debate about this recovery plan a difficult one, because first of all, they will have to make a difficult decision in terms of arbitration between, priorities, climate change, digital Europe, European defense, so on and so forth. And they won't have enough money for everything. but then they will try to introduce conditionality on rule of law, as we were saying, on migration, etc. And this are going to be interesting but difficult and very highly political discussion. And this is maybe where political Europe will slowly move back into the front line. Mm-hmm. On Macron's vision of Europe, I would tend to say, forget Macron for a while. Just look at the substance, because Macron can be a very provocative figure sometimes, etc. And people can have difficulties with his vision. But the vision of a political Europe, it has been there from the beginning, and it's still there, and it's more obviously relevant more than ever. And it seems to me that you can't try to avoid that debate and go on thinking that Europe, after all, is only about an internal market and improving maybe the Eurozone. At the end of the day, as Judy is rightly saying, in this human crisis we're facing, it's all about solidarity, which is very much at the heart of the whole political project of Europe. And so whatever European leaders are doing in trying to escape that debate, they will have to come back to it. Maybe the crisis, right in the crunch of the crisis, is not the right moment. I personally think it is. I personally think it's the right moment to do that, because this idea of a political Europe is completely connected to everything we would like to do, even in the international scene, as I was saying earlier. It's about Europe having a clear idea of the kind of global actor it wants to be and it wants to play. It may not be able to perform that altogether. So, okay, let's look at the idea of having only a core group of member states moving ahead if they want to do that, because this you could do in the international scene. And to some extent, it is exactly what's happening at the moment. When you are asking the second question, Rosa, is it time for reform? I'm quite impressed by how, in his individual capacity, Josep Borrell, the new High Representative, is moving ahead in spite of all the divisions he's facing among member states. He's coming out with individual statements on WHO, on the settlement, the forthcoming settlement policy of the new Israeli government, and speaking out his mind very bluntly, openly, what he thinks about it, showing that Europe has a voice, at least. Now, it's maybe not a credible, legitimate, and authoritative enough voice, but it's still something. And I think we should try to build on that. And those who want to follow him should follow him, and we will see how things happen. What Europe needs more than ever is to be more agile and more proactive and to move ahead and to be active. And this is what it's all about at the moment.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm going to give the last 2 minutes to Stefan. We won't have time for extra questions, but at the end, I'll just read out the questions and say something about them. Stefan, please.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think this current crisis is really increasing the centrifugal tendencies so far, because the member states are asserting their own position, their own role. They're less looking towards Brussels than previously, and this kind of tendency is hard to reverse. What could reverse it is strong leadership, and therefore I don't agree with Pierre that we should forget Macron. Because ultimately, if you look at every real step forward by the European Union over the decades, it was done by leaders, Kohl, Mitterrand, others, Delors. Leadership is absolutely crucial in this regard. And unfortunately, at the present time, we have some very talented politicians. Some of them are even sort of Europe-minded, but we don't have the kind of leadership that it would really take at this stage. And it's also not coming from the Brussels institutions. Therefore, I really see a big deficit in this regard. But I agree completely with Pierre that if you look at the overall global constellation of forces, there's a huge role for Europe there. Basically, as a defender of multilateralism, we would have many allies in this struggle in terms of making Europe itself more resilient by catching up in terms of digital technology, for instance, of making sure that we are better prepared for further health risks, by exerting a strong leadership role when it comes to climate. So I think everything calls for a stronger and forceful and energetic Europe. But what is at the moment not there is the kind of leadership that would really bring the member states together behind such an agenda.
Thank you very much. It is 4 o'clock and we have run out of our time. So I'm afraid I won't be able to ask the final questions, but I do just want to read out a few issues that our listeners have been, audience have been asking, with a view perhaps to using these as prompts for the next discussion. One question is whether Europe's greatest source of power is as a standard setter, and can Europe wield influence as a standard setter after the crisis? Another question, which I think is of critical importance, is the relations with neighbours, and where is there any bandwidth left to integrate neighbours into the coronavirus response? And finally, another question about civil society and the degree to which rethinking the institutions also involves a dialogue, a more structured dialogue with citizens' participation. I think these are all three are very important topics which we can explore further in other discussions, but unfortunately today we have run out of our time. So let me thank all our scholars for joining in this very interesting conversation. I would also like to thank the invisible team, those you can't see, who've actually put this together and enabled us all to be on the screen at the same time. Thank you very much. And I hope I hope that we'll be able to organize more discussions through these online means and to reach out to a broader or a broadening audience now that we have the opportunity of going global with our conversations. Thank you very much.